The Philippine peso sank to its lowest level ever, closing at 57 pesos against the US dollar. What does this mean for the ordinary Filipinos? China Bank's Domini Velasquez joins us now for her views. Domini, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us, why has the peso fallen this low, historical lows against the US dollar?
Hi Rico, yes. So it closed today at 57 pesos, right, to a US dollar. I guess two things always when we're talking about currencies. So the Philippine peso was actually, there's a depreciating tendency because we have a higher current account deficit this year, meaning we have more imports as opposed to exports. That's why we need more dollars to finance these imports. So just to give you an example, in 2021, the current account deficit was around 6.9 billion US dollars. This year, the BSP expects the deficit to be around 20 billion US dollars. Another thing, though, also is the US dollar is really quite strong this year. It's actually strongest since 2002. And this has not affected just the Philippine peso. It has affected other currencies.
So is it also possible, Domini, that the Philippine peso also continues to depreciate apart from the strong dollar is because our central bank is not as aggressive in rising or raising interest rates compared to the US Fed, which they have already said they will hike interest rates yet again?
I think the central bank has actually been quite aggressive. If you look at central banks across Asia, the BSP is actually the most aggressive now, hiking 175 basis points since May. Of course, the Fed has hiked much more by 225, really because inflation in the US is much more higher, right? It was around 8.5% in July compared to our 6.3%. So there are different factors that affect your interest rate and your inflation. So it's not really a one-to-one correspondence between the federal rate hike and the BSP's rate hike.
So Domini, with our expanding current account deficit and the strong dollar, are we likely to see the peso continuing to fall against the US dollar? Could it hit 58, 59, or even 60?
Well, we can't say for sure where it's going to be, right? But we think it's still going to depreciate further, largely because we expect another 75 basis point rate hike by the Fed in its September meeting. So there is that factor.
What are the pros and cons of a very weak peso against the US dollar?
Of course, it affects different sectors of the economy. For example, for your overseas Filipinos, a weak peso is actually beneficial to OFWs and their families. Like your 51 peso, your $1 at the start of the year was worth 51 pesos, right? Now it's worth 57 pesos. So it gives more money to the pockets of families. It also benefits exporters because they earn more when they sell their goods or services in US dollar. But of course, it also is quite cumbersome for, let's say, consumers. As a nation, we're importing food and oil. So this has actually also stoked a little bit of inflation.
So there are plus and minuses, but net, is this a plus or a minus for the economy?
I think when you talk about foreign exchange, it's like the price of good, right? Of any good or services. There's really a equilibrium point. What we don't want to see is actually the volatility. We don't want a peso very volatile, that businesses and consumers will find it hard to predict where the peso will be, or there will be speculative activities.
So the last Bangko Central meeting, they raised interest rates, and before that, in between meetings, they raised interest rates as well. Why aren't we seeing the Bangko Central intervening to support the peso?
Well, the policy rate, the off-cycle hike in July, that was the 75 basis points. I think generally that was really to stem the depreciation of the peso. During that time, the peso was already depreciating to the 56.45, which was the all-time high previously, right? So it actually tempered this kind of volatility. So now we're seeing a little bit of action also, but not as volatile as before. before. Really, the 75 basis points, the 50 basis points after, helped the peso trend downwards
Right.
in a more path. Yeah.
All right. We saw the inflation rate for August at 6.3%. With all of these interest rate hikes of 1.25%, are you disappointed that inflation only fell by 0.1%?
Not so much because we're actually seeing higher inflation. We think the 6.3, it's not going to be, the 6.4 last month was not going to be the highest. We think it's still going to hit new highs in maybe sometime in the fourth quarter. For us, we're seeing October where the inflation will be it's at its highest in 2020.
All right, Domini, briefly before we let you go, where do you see the Philippine peso by year's end? What is the outlook of China Bank and for inflation?
Okay, as mentioned, for the Philippine peso, we're really now taking it data by data. We're in our uncharted territory now. So we think it will test the 58 levels. But again, trend-wise, depreciating peso is likely to continue maybe until next year. For inflation, we're actually quite happy with the slower inflation this month. But for the rest of the year, we think it's going to still go up and then maybe hit maybe 5.5% on average for 2020.
Domini, thank you so much for your outlook on the peso against the US dollar and inflation. China Bank Chief Economist Domini Velasquez.